College football nerds, we are here talking Auburn and Texas A&M, and it's been a while maybe since we've talked to either of these fan bases. I want to remind you, as we always do, please give us your score prediction in the comments, and we will get down there and mix it up with you, especially since this is the only preview video we're doing this week. Life has kind of gotten in the way for both of Josh and myself, and it's kind of just a down week, so it's pretty good timing. I think it's kind of bonkers weeks from here on out. So also, if you want some more content from us this week, we do a live show, and that is available on our channel for replay, as well as on our podcast. All that's linked in the description. Very little housekeeping this week, Josh. Okay, so let's talk about this game. And what's interesting to me, really, just out of the gate, Josh, is these are two teams who at one point to start the season, so A&M came in with high expectations, and then they kind of got brought down to earth after the Mississippi State loss. So that was their second loss in the season. Auburn fans didn't come in with as high of expectations, and then we're a little bit crestfallen maybe after the Georgia State game, where we were also maybe the hardest on Auburn to this point at that point throughout the year. But both now are kind of playing for maybe the SEC West and to play Georgia in Atlanta if some things go the right way, which is a testament to both of these coaching staffs and teams to kind of pull it out of the fire to be in the conversation in November. And that's really all you could hope for after how the season started for both of these teams. So before we talk about this matchup, I want you to walk through that kind of SEC West and this being a gateway game for that, maybe even more than the Iron Bowl.
Yeah, the interesting thing, everybody's got focused on the Iron Bowl, but right now Texas A&M has 2 losses. Alabama already has 1 loss. If Auburn were to win out and say beat Alabama, then Alabama's going to be a 2-loss team. So a lot of the questions comes down to how many 2-loss teams are there going to be? This game ends up being the gatekeeper for that. If Texas A&M beats Auburn, then Texas A&M's a 2-loss team. Auburn becomes a 2-loss team. Let's say Auburn turns around and beats Alabama. They're all 2-loss teams. And you think, well, but Alabama's Alabama, right? And they're higher ranked. There's a lot of tiebreakers that come into play when you have a bunch of teams all with the same number of losses. So if you assume, A&M beats Auburn and they both win out, you have a 3-way 2-loss tiebreaker. But Texas A&M has a 2-0 record versus the other teams in the tiebreaker. And the first prong is the head-to-head record of the teams. So if Texas A&M beats Auburn and Auburn beats Alabama, Texas A&M is actually the team that goes to the SEC championship game. However, if Auburn beats Texas A&M now has 3 losses. They're pretty well out of it. Auburn now has to avoid losing to a couple more of their games, and they go into the Iron Bowl with the game being for all the marbles. In fact, if Auburn beats Texas A&M, right, and let's say they lose to Mississippi State, then they go into the Alabama game and they can get the head-to-head to Alabama. At that point, it gets really complicated because you might have a lot of 2-loss teams. But the short version of it is whoever wins this game is very much in the driver's seat to supplant Alabama for the SEC West Championship. And given that the Iron Bowl hasn't been played yet, if you're assuming, the road does go through Tuscaloosa, so to speak, but it's equally true that it goes through this game. So this game is just as pivotal. Everybody focuses on whether Alabama's going to make it, but this game pretty much determines who's the other team that has a good shot of being the one to go.
And again, the thing that I think is exciting for Auburn and A&M fans is that they're in that discussion right now. And maybe more so on the Auburn side, this is a team that we've admitted that has looked a lot better and improved more than we expected. They're a better team right now than we thought they would be at this point when we were, addressing Auburn in their season a month ago. Like, they have literally done better. But also I think there's been some fortune there, and Auburn fans don't want to hear this, but real quick, I want you to talk about, and in our preview last week, I picked Auburn to win. You picked Ole Miss, I think, to really struggle and maybe win a close one. But both of us said that this is going to be really because of, or at least aided by, the fact that Ole Miss is a lot depleted. So coming into this A&M game, one, I'd love for you to touch on the stat that you showcased on Twitter about the Ole Miss, depletion. And two, is this a whole different scenario for Auburn coming into a game on the road against a team that's rested and hasn't been through a grind and is pretty healthy.
Yeah, I mean, the injury situation at Ole Miss was significant. And the stat that I put out there was 216 of Ole Miss's 307 yards were to a walk-on wide receiver and a walk-on tight end. And that's because in the first half, they lose Drummond, who was the only remaining starting receiver/tight end on the roster. And at that point, they were all second-string players, a couple of which are walk-ons because they don't have depth. Now, let me be super, super clear, because people always take this the wrong way. A win is a win is a win. Injuries are part of football. Ole Miss's inability to recruit, to have depth, to be able to replace those guys is an important part of this conversation. However, we're not talking about Auburn beating Ole Miss, and we're not discounting Auburn beating Ole Miss. We're talking about whether Auburn would beat Texas A&M. And when you're trying to project these teams out, and you're talking about how good Auburn is versus Ole Miss, frankly, there's just no way you can't throw out, okay, but when you take away 2 offensive linemen, all 3 starting receivers, and the starting tight end, 6 of 11 offensive starters, Ole Miss is a crippled version of what they were before. And I'm not sure how much it says that you beat that particular Ole Miss squad. As I said, there's a reason we were divided on it. And I'll tell you, if you told me that they were going to lose Drummond, who was by far their best remaining target, and Matt Corral was going to sprain his other ankle, I would have totally picked Auburn to win that game. So my perception personally of Auburn doesn't change. Now, good luck is good luck in terms of scheduling luck. You play a team that's missing their starting quarterback and you beat them, you still get a W. You still get to go to the championship game, et cetera, et cetera. So that's in no way discounting any of that. But I'm just talking about in terms of projecting this game. Auburn has been a little bit fortunate in playing Arkansas after they've fallen off. They played Ole Miss after they've fallen off tremendously, and I think Ole Miss is going to continue to lose games. And on the other side of the ball, Texas A&M has 2 really stupid losses to end the year, but I think we can both agree, right? Texas A&M is just not the same team they were to start the year. They seem to be improving tremendously.
I think that, and I'll answer that question after I address another thing about Ole Miss, where I wasn't hugely impressed with the Ole Miss win, where a lot of people are going to say, hey, Auburn beat a top 10 team, that's impressive, who don't know the details. I was impressed with the Arkansas win. I know you said they fell off and there's a little motivation factor there, but they won that soundly. Like, that was a comfortable win against a team that has shown to be good this year. I was also impressed with their defensive performance against LSU, a team that's not good this year, and they're a shell of their former LSU self defensively. But offensively, they can score some points. They put up 49 or something against Florida. That's a good offensive team in stretches, and Auburn held them pretty well. So where Auburn fans might say, hey, wait, give us credit for Ole Miss, and they're mad, they can take solace in knowing that we were impressed with 2 other wins that nobody's really giving them credit for, and they should. On the A&M side, I have a bit of optimism and concern, and this is a concern that you always piss Ohio State fans off with, and I'm going to piss A&M fans off with, in that, yes, they do seem better, but some of it isn't incomplete. Now, they do get tremendous credit for the Alabama win. But in terms of saying, was that a one-off thing, or is this a consistent pattern of improvement, I want to see them beat somebody that's not terrible. And that doesn't mean that you should be offended by that. That just means it's an incomplete. Let's see it. We saw Ohio State come out and struggle with Penn State, even though it's a pretty good win, because they hadn't really been challenged. So that, for me, is what I want to kind of see. I want to see A&M consistently build towards who we thought they were. I think they can do that. What does the model think that A&M can or cannot do, and what Auburn is or is not?
Yeah, so the model does favor Auburn in this game. It has them favored by 3, 22-19. And I think maybe the most interesting thing about the model is this is a low-scoring game mainly because it doesn't love either offense. Now, statistically, these teams are not great offensive teams. Simply put, they're just not. Texas A&M has a good run game at 5.3 yards per carry, but the passing game is still sitting at 6.8 yards per attempt. Auburn is at 4.9 yards per carry, 7.3 yards per attempt. We often say 7.5 yards per attempt is a competent passing attack. Neither one of these teams hits that mark on average. Now, the run game, anything over solid, and they're both in that range. But there's a reason that these teams have had something of a limiter, and it is the fact that the passing game is just good enough to sort of complement the run game when the run game's being effective. But when you look in the statistics, it's really the defensive deficiencies, if you will, that are making this such a game. Auburn is allowing 95% of opponent passing averages. Texas A&M is allowing 99% of opponent run averages. Now, Auburn's run defense is allowing 80%. Texas A&M's defense is allowing 80% passing. The 80% passing against is a little better from A&M than 80% rushing from Auburn, just because it's kind of hard to hold teams to lower rushing passing averages. Passing games travel. That's why they show up in the playoffs. But on the whole, I don't think most people really have the perception that Auburn and A&M are 90% of opponent averages, right? I think they're viewed as a good defenses, and we can flesh that out in just a minute. But what our model is suggesting is, Auburn is pretty good against the run, or at least has been, but has been very average against the pass. And A&M in general has been very average against the run and good against the pass. Good. 80% against the pass is good, but not necessarily elite. And so you end up with a game that are kind of these teams' averages, and it's still 22-19 just because the teams aren't necessarily offensive powerhouses. The thing I want to flag, though, is how much is it fair to judge Auburn's passing game, which has improved tremendously since Bo Nix got benched, and how fair is it to judge Texas A&M's run defense? So I'm going to run with this a bit, and then I'll sort of give it back to you to comment. Texas A&M's rushing offense in particular, or rushing defense, in particular, has been sort of all over the place. Earlier in the year, they gave up over 200 yards rushing to Kent State. They gave up 4.5 yards per carry to Colorado, who's really bad, over 4 yards per carry to Arkansas. But it was the Mississippi State game where they've settled down. There was about less than 3.5 yards a carry to Mississippi State, South Missouri to South Carolina. Alabama, who is a very good run team, was held to about 4.5 yards per carry. That's a solid mark. That's less than Auburn is projected to have right now. And then when you talk about Auburn, just to throw the stats out, Auburn's passing game, really, really anemic through Georgia State. 4.7 yards per attempt against Penn State, 5.9 against Georgia State. LSU was 6. In the last couple weeks, 11 yards per attempt against Arkansas, 8.9 against Ole Miss. So one thing that I'm kind of skittish of is it shows the offensive output and rankings and the adjustment for opposing defenses. But I do think Texas A&M, obviously offensively is a lot better, but I think defensively they're playing a lot better than they did early in the year. And then Auburn offensively has improved a lot versus where they were early in the year. So this is one game in particular where I think the model, by looking at the entire year, probably doesn't paint a very accurate picture. In my mind, these teams do need to be judged a little bit based off who they have been the last 3 or 4 weeks, and a little less based off who they were in the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season.
My only issue or concern there is that Missouri and South Carolina are so hard to learn anything from. On the Auburn side, Bo Nix mentioned that he had a shoulder injury going into the Georgia State game, and that impacted his play and his preparation. There might be something there to that. I think it's something more that's impacting that, and you talked about it when we were doing kind of our pregame discussion, and it's that this offensive staff for Auburn has really kind of retooled how they see what they can do with Bo Nix and what they can do with this offense. And they have, and I know Auburn fans really bristle at this when you mention that Bo Nix is going to do his kind of sandlot sort of thing, and they're like, well, he doesn't really do that, and you're taking 1 or 2 plays. Know that he does, and it may not show up in a play where he just runs around like crazy and throws a touchdown. There is a lot of kind of freelance in that game, in his game that they allow and have kind of leaned into the last few weeks. My concern, Josh, is kind of like we talked with Georgia, in that they have this 35, 37 point ceiling in their offense. I wonder if all of the stuff that we expect is going to happen from Auburn's offense with Bo Nix and how they've run it of late, it's going to generate X amount of points. But there's so many inefficiencies baked in there. Might it have a limit where they're going to get 24 points every single game, but they probably aren't going to get much more than that against a good defense or an even competent defense? Because make no mistake, Ole Miss is not a competent defense.
I think so. And one of my big concerns for Auburn this year is that the receiving core, while it's improving, is still not great. This is a major retooling year for them. It happens. A lot of teams around the conference are going through the same thing. It's kind of why offense is down regionally, even nationally. But Auburn needs to run the ball well to throw the ball. And it's no coincidence that early in the game, when Tank Bigsby and to a lesser extent Hunter were being successful, Auburn was being successful throwing the football because Ole Miss was doing a lot of stuff rotating safeties down last week. They were attacking the line of scrimmage. They gave up a couple big runs that way, but for the most part, when they started doing that, they started stymieing the run. But the trade-off was all of a sudden Bo Nix had one-on-one opportunities. And if you have a guy that can create and run around, it's difficult to play man coverage in those situations and be able to cover guy, for the 5, 6, 7 seconds that Bo Nix has bought himself. The key to all that was, though, the ability of Auburn to run the ball. And here's one of the statistics I flagged going into this when I was looking for an edge. Auburn has played 4 teams so far, right? And the rushing defense ranking of those 4 teams within the SEC is number 1 in Georgia, and then it's number 9 in LSU, number 10 in Arkansas, and number 13 in Ole Miss. And if you look at which games they were competitive in and which ones they weren't, it's pretty clear. Georgia was the non-competitive one. LSU, Arkansas, and Ole Miss, they looked almost progressively better against those 3. I mean, LSU was a game that was a tight game, one Auburn could have very easily lost. Ole Miss was one they were maybe, you noted Arkansas was a sound win, but I think Ole Miss, they moved the ball better in a lot of ways. The problem is, if you're Auburn, tied for number 2 is Alabama and Mississippi State. Number 6 is Texas A&M. Auburn themselves is number 5. So of the top 6 rush defenses in the SEC, you're about to have to play 3 of the other 5. And this game, to me, it's more than just sort of the gateway to the end of the season. I think it's going to be really telling as to how Auburn's going to finish, right? Can Auburn move the ball and score against a team that can effectively stop the run? Is that going to put a limiter on them to, like you're saying, 20 to 24 points? I suspect, just given by how things have gone this year, how they did against Penn State, it likely will. I don't think if you are able to play Auburn straight up and defend the run, and I think Tank Bigsby is a phenomenal back, probably one of the most underrated players nationally. He carries that offense, and if he's not able to get his against standard looks, I don't know that the receivers Auburn has are going to get open. It doesn't matter how much Bo Nix runs around. I just don't know that they have any weapons to create opportunities, and so I think things slow down. Again, though, the flip side is Auburn's defense is quite good, so can Texas A&M actually outscore them? I don't know that answer either, and this is the last thing I say because this is a bit of a monologue, but Missouri and South Carolina are terrible teams. And one of the most difficult things about projecting this game is I do think A&M has turned the corner a little bit against Alabama. Like last week, against South Carolina, Calzada was over 10 yards per attempt in the third quarter at one point. They kind of let off late and the stats fell off. But they look better eye test wise than they did against even bad teams earlier in the year. But how much of that is an asterisk due to competition? I think both these teams are about to face some better teams in some different ways, and they're both really evolving. And I think trying to find the intersection of all that and project the game is extremely difficult.
So, Josh, I'm going to give my score prediction here with a backdrop of kind of where Auburn is right now. And when you give your prediction, I'd love for you to tell me if you agree with this thought or not. In my mind, Auburn this week is, other than the massive catastrophic injuries, Auburn this week is where Ole Miss was last week. Ole Miss had gone through a grindy stretch of games where they weren't playing a ton of like elite teams, but if you play enough good teams in a row that you have to mentally get up for because they're good enough to beat you, they may not be better than you. There's a difference between being better than you and being good enough to beat you. And if you have to play in a row a bunch of teams that are good enough to beat you, it wears on you physically and mentally. And we got A&M coming in fresh and at home. And so Auburn last week was coming in fresh and at home, playing a team that had been kind of ground up and spit out. I think there's some of that that's going to happen here. Auburn could, this game could have been totally flipped, I think, if these two teams played in week 3. But right now, home field, rested. I'm going with A&M 24-20, which would be a push right now.
Yeah, so my score was 21-17, and I have a lot of the same thought. Missouri and South Carolina were not terribly hard opponents. Texas A&M is in better shape. They're a little more stable, a little more rested. I think Auburn's has a chance to go in this game a little tired. There are a lot of Auburn fans here. I don't know why, but well, I have some ideas why. When we do our top 10 rankings, I don't think anyone hates anything more than when we give Texas A&M credit for being a reasonably good team. Now, look, those 2 losses early in the year were bad losses. Now, you can explain it a little bit. Mississippi State is a good front. I'll say that's a sneaky trap game for Auburn next week. If they win or lose, that's going to be a pretty exhausting team to play given the matchups. Mississippi State's strengths and weaknesses are going to be tough for Auburn. And then Arkansas, that was just a bad loss. But that was a loss where you're missing your starting quarterback. Calzada very much had not gotten his feet under him. I think Texas A&M is a reasonably good team that has 2 stupid losses. Those two stupid losses matter for the win-loss record. They count. There's something that should be considered when you're looking at a team for the playoff. Those 2 losses will not lose them the Auburn game. Past results do not indicate future outcomes, right? And Texas A&M, I think, is a good team. I think they're a very dangerous team. I don't think it's a slight on Auburn to pick Texas A&M to win this, given the situation. I think a lot of people are just sort of sleeping on where they're at. But I do think if you're Texas A&M, you're going to be kicking yourself at the end of the year because I think they very easily could win out the rest of the schedule. Go 10-2, Alabama beats Auburn, and all of a sudden Texas A&M sitting at home going, oh my gosh, if we had just not lost one of those 2 stupid games, we would be in the SEC West Championship. But, such are the cards that were dealt, right?
Part of me feels like they lost the Mississippi State game, and that's why they won the Alabama game. Either they were playing with nothing to lose, or they got caught prepping a little early, which has happened to some coaches before. A&M fans would love to hear and know that I've just been getting shelled all week for the last 2 weeks, being called a super SEC homer because I have Texas A&M like 6th or 7th in my top 10. And what I said when we did our top 10s was, it's okay if you want to call me an SEC homer or an A&M homer or a whatever homer, but make sure you put your top 10 list in the comments so I can scrutinize your pick of who you are going to put ahead of them. Because at this point in the year, in this season of all seasons, everybody's got warts. And there's only 2 teams in the country who have wins of top 5 teams, current top 5 teams, and that's Oregon and Texas A&M. So whomever you're putting ahead of A&M doesn't have nearly as good of a win unless it's Oregon. And so like give me your bet. Like give me who you got up there and let's see how it all plays out. So A&M, y'all better not let me down or make me look foolish. All right, y'all, that's it for us on this one. This was, again, our only one this week, so we really want to have fun with it. Thanks so much, y'all, for hanging with us. Have a great week, and God bless.